Welcome back, everyone, to this next session of the Dynamic Spectrum Alliance Global Summit. I'm particularly looking forward to this session, which is looking at spectrum sharing while protecting incumbents. The rules are always interesting, but they always change when the rubber hits the road. And so we have the luxury of hearing from practical experiences from Mozambique, from Peru, and also from some of the giants that have been supporting dynamic spectrum, Microsoft and Google. And to moderate that, I'd like to welcome Jane Coffin, Senior Vice President at the Internet Society, who have been a tireless champion of affordable access for the underserved around the world. Welcome, Jane.
Thank you, Steve. And we are looking forward to this excellent lineup of panelists that are, as Steve had said, are going to talk to you more about spectrum sharing while protecting incumbents through multi-stakeholder collaboration. And as many of us know, many voices in the mix to help formulate policy and regulatory action are needed. And without further ado, we are going to turn over to Dr. David. And David's going to give us some perspective from his country and his region. So David, over to you. And thank you all for this great opportunity.
Thank you, Jane. Hello, everyone. My name is Salomão David. I work for the Communications Regulatory Authority of Mozambique. We have been doing research with TV white spaces for the past, I would say, 3 to 4 years. And with this new normal, we had to find new ways to keep deploying our networks around the country. So I'll start my presentation by speaking about what we have been doing for the past year. This year we had several challenges that forced us to provide free spectrum to ISPs and MNOs, mobile network operators, and we exempt them for paying for short number acquisition fees, for type approval, for all types of equipment, because we want them to keep importing equipment for internet, as we have equipment to be able to provide access to the internet. As you might be aware, we have a regulation for TV white spaces in place for the past 2 years. And up to date, we had only, I would say, our deployments that reach around now 11 to 12, and some private people just deploying for trying and experimenting technology, either for farming, either for IoT, and normal business. We allow also the postal operators to renew the postal license without any charges, and operators are they are not allowed during this period to increase prices. This is the general umbrella of what we have been doing in terms of regulation. That has an impact of when we try to assign spectrum to different operators. So let's go ahead to the next slide, where I will try to explain basically what we did with the model rules that we have for dynamic spectrum allocation. This time we did not use a database. Basically, with the spectrum we have assigned to MNOs and ISPs, we tried to create public spaces where people could have access to the internet, and they should be very length in big areas, because schools are closed, so people need to study or to have access to the internet. They need to have access to the internet in places where they are considered to be safe. We pick gardens, football grounds, and places like that, and we just deployed infrastructure. So what we did was telling the ISPs or MNOs to share the spectrum. This is an experience which for a giant company like mobile network operator is not something that they are willing to do easily. They do not want normally to share spectrum, but ISPs, they are more like inclined to share spectrum. If you tell them that they're gonna have a higher amount of spectrum of our operator, which is on the next town or 2 towns away, they'll be willing to use that spectrum, as long as it is to provide to the rural community. So the networks are normally managed by ISPs or MNO who wants to experiment or try the dynamic spectrum access, but at this case using sensing. Basically what we did is using something similar to an RF Explorer, put it sensing the spectrum for 1 to 2 weeks, and then gather the results to the lab and try to analyze what type of spectrums we can use without interfering with the incumbent of that region. In this case, we normally pick the smallest ISPs in the community, and the places or the spots that have to be deployed the internet are selected by the community. This should be a place where they feel comfortable going. And we also managed to refurbish the place, like putting tables, putting charging stations and things like that. So we managed to do this in 15 districts where people have access to the internet using such a technology, and the RFE explorers are still there sensing, and in case something changes, we are able to just remotely log in and either shut down the station or assign a different frequency band. So basically, next slide, please. Basically, we learned that when you are trying to share spectrum, when you are talking about ISPs or LTE bands, it's pretty much easy. They're much more flexible. They are more inclined to reuse and use spectrum, maybe because of the size of the business. So we never had any interference incident, and all ISPs which are part of this initiative, they work on a gentleman's agreement. Everyone have got almost a similar type of equipment. Nobody, interferes with anybody. And the only thing that we notice when you talk as a regulator, let's share spectrum, the process is a bit lengthy. There is not everybody is willing to share the spectrum. They are more willing that I have my band, I'm gonna use my band the way I want to use, and nobody should use it, not even any place, or the next town or the next district. So this is a bit confusing for us because the number of people who we normally have on a network, it increased a lot. So at some points where you want to have lots of people connected and they want to have a very good user experience, it's really required a higher amount of spectrum. So we managed to do this by allowing them to share. But when we talk about MNOs, they are very skeptical about sharing, even sharing in places where they do not have infrastructure or they do not have any business. One interference incident just made us think that it was not viable to do so with the lower type of technique we are using, because before we used to use databases and everything, but now we can no longer use this type of service. As of now, we need to intervene as a regulator, but for MNOs, the process is still being lengthy. Thank you for your time. This is what we have been doing in Mozambique during this year, and I appreciate to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we're going to come back to you with some great questions about how you've been doing what you've been doing. I'm very interested in the fact that the MNOs might have a different philosophy than the ISPs, and you've had to navigate and create some balance there in your country. But thank you for what you're doing, because you're leading the way for more agile and innovative use of spectrum. So thank you. Our next speaker is José Aguilar, who's coming to us from Peru. And José, we're turning it over to you to give us some perspective from your country. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Marta. Thank you all. Well, my name is José Aguilar. I am General Director for Policies and Regulation Communications for Peru. And well, we talk about many things that we are developing now in this moment. So please, we can see the slides. Perfect. We are working very hard in three axes. The first is digital infrastructure. So, for example, for faced with COVID-19 outbreak, we developed many measures. For example, the first was a legislative decree for establish a measure that facilitate the installation of infrastructure necessary for the provision of the public telecommunication service in this health emergency. It is very, very useful because it's reduced the administrative procedures for the enterprise, so we can develop faster. And the second axe was the licensed spectrum, because we know it's very important, the spectrum to help to reduce the digital divide. And for example, we approved in April another legislative decree that authorized a temporary assignment of radioelectric spectrum in the framework of the national health emergency decree by the COVID-19. So it works like any enterprise can require a spectrum, temporary, but they need to coverage commitments. So for example, we have managed them to connect 250 half posts in Peru, and also about licensing spectrum, we are working in another document. It is a working document for public consultation on 3.5 gigahertz and 26 gigahertz spectrum, tender for 5G that has just been published yesterday. And the third act is unlicensed spectrum. Because it's very, we are clear that it's very important, this spectrum because it's focused directly on the users. So we are working in the document that I told you. We propose identify 500 megahertz in the frequency band. So for Wi-Fi 6 and 5G and are unlicensed, but in the low part of the band. For the high part of the band, we are expecting the result of the World Radio Conference. The next slide, please. So, to implement this, the use of the 5 gigahertz band, we have three phases, and we have working very hard with dynamic spectrum islands also. And for example, the phase one, we think the short run, the low power indoors. We think will be used for low power device indoors and used for Wi-Fi. So, for example, we can have user application that citizens can use within the ecosystem of device that is enabled. And we have also another phase, phase 2 and phase 3, that is the use of this band in outsides. So, but we are expecting that maybe in the long run. And so, like I say, we have yesterday published a document. So we expect the commentaries of all the sectors, enterprise, and persons. The next, please. Thank you. Well, the next slide is a proposal use of the frequency band. So, like I say, it's like the phase one, the use of unlicensed spectrum for device operating at low power indoors. Also, we know that it's very important to regard many considerations of use of interiors, and we take into account the following. Outdoor use is not allowed, and access points cannot operate on battery because we need to avoid mobility and prevent risk. It's also, in this regard, it's also for safety. The use in cars, views, trains, drones, it's prohibited. So that is our plan in the next months. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jose. This is really exciting news about the proceeding that opened up today, and I understand that you're leading that proceeding. So we'll expect to see some great things. And thank you for doing what you're doing in Peru. It's really important for regulators and policymakers to pave the way for others to make more change by looking at your proceedings, particularly with the 6 gigahertz for Wi-Fi. So this is exciting. Thank you very much, and we'll be coming back to you with some questions. Our next panelist is Dr. Preston Marshall. Preston, over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Jane, and Martha, thanks for inviting me. I want to talk a little bit, put up my slides, about coalition building and the necessity to look beyond spectrum sharing as a one-to-one relationship with an incumbent. And a lot of this was lessons that we learned during the journey to make CBRS happen in the United States. CBRS, if you're not familiar with it, is unique among sharing, because in most of the sharing regimes, we thought about a single sharing partner sharing with an incumbent. And in CBRS, we have a community of sharing, a very, very unique from each other applications in the band. So next slide, please. So, when we look at spectrum sharing, there's essentially two endpoint models: hostile entry forced by regulator. Effectively, we argue to a third party to force sharing. The US 6 gigahertz proceeding is certainly an example of that. The point-to-point community was not pleased with the idea of sharing, and it's been forced by the FCC. The other model, which is actually the CBRS model, is cooperative entry, where there's an advantage to the incumbent. It's rare to see that case, but in this case, we had an incumbent who really wanted to create, I think, more political support for keeping the band as it was, and their own usage was fairly sparse. So by getting a community in there, they actually protected the band from reallocation. So in that case, this was cooperative with the US DoD. Next slide, please. So this, if you look at all of this dialogue about sharing, including like the IEEE Dynamic Sharing Conference, which I helped form, we really focused on the relationship between an incumbent and a single sharing proposal. And what does it take? Next slide. And there's a lot of engineering in this, but what we've seen is that the second half of this, the creating that community that will share, is actually been the more complex problem, both technically and politically. To get the political support to make these things happen, oftentimes one use case is just not sufficient. So in CBRS, ultimately, we had to drag all of these use cases: rural broadband, cable operators wanting to build their own networks, mobile, conventional mobile operators, fixed wireless, which is a very significant function in the United States. If you search Google, you'll see private LTE has just exploded in Industry 4.0. It took all of those to see this as an advantage, to put this over the top. Next slide, please. So this is really the hard problem. When I sort of took the job at Google to lead Google's CBRS effort, I imagined myself doing a lot of the stuff at the top, bit error rates, S over I plus N. In fact, the work went into creating the political, economic, social values that we had to aggregate across a lot of these use cases. Typically, what we've seen is people who want to share someone else's spectrum are often very unwilling to share the spectrum they gained in that process, and that infighting really weakens the case we make for sharing. And so this, I think, is a sort of under-researched, under-considered problem. Next slide. As we go forward. So if we're going to create more spectrum sharing, we look more broadly for how do we create alliances that can benefit. Next slide. So, in the US CBRS band, we almost learned this the hard way. First engagement was convince DoD that sharing was beneficial to them. We had the president behind the PCAST report. NTIA had done work with CSMAC. The groundwork was laid for this. But the engagement, too, to create a user alliance was actually the harder part. Pretty much everyone initially opposed it because their vision was, if there's going to be spectrum, it should be for me, not for everybody. Google was really the only large company supporter. The administration changed in the US, and the administration coming in at the FCC kind of remembered all the objections of the community. And so to keep this from dying, we really had to form a very atypical alliance. And if you look to the right, you'll see we had mobile operators, cable companies, private network operators. We now have in CBRS Alliance almost 190 companies. So it's taken that alliance building to have the influence to keep the sharing alive. And so both technically to how do we create coexistence among these players as a technical problem, and then how do we create common interests as a political problem, was actually the big challenge in CBRS. So it's important to work on the engineering, it's important to work on incumbent relationships, but we need to put a lot of work into how do we create the coalitions that create the very large social value that helps put the impetus behind spectrum sharing. Thanks very much. Look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. And you've just highlighted something that we often say, which is it's the human nuts that run the nets. And it's building those coalitions, which can be very difficult, as you see. But congratulations for the great work that you're doing at Google. Next up on our agenda is Jeffrey Yan. And Jeffrey, over to you.
Thank you, Jane. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you, DSA, thank you, Martha, for inviting Microsoft and me. Can I have the slides up, please? So I want to start with maybe just kind of a concluding slide that I have. It's just that, given the time, I want to talk about the topic of spectrum sharing, which in fact this room is a group of people who you don't need to argue spectrum sharing with, even though I believe we all have different degree of belief in it in terms of where it is, how far we've gone. The fact that we have heard so much about spectrum sharing, and I'm very grateful to follow the presentations from my colleagues just now, and also from Chairman Pai and Philip Marnick from Ofcom, which just so happen it validates a lot of points I want to make in my short presentation here. And I want to start by saying that spectrum sharing is not the normal yet. It's not a norm, but we believe that it ought to be the norm, and it can be the norm. And the technology and human factors, in fact, is one of the biggest barrier, which I'll talk about a little bit about the mindset. And spectrum sharing is predicated on incumbent protection. Otherwise, we probably would have called this session repurposing or refarming of a spectrum. So that's a given. And I hope to be able to provide a couple of examples where, like Dr. Preston was saying, it's really a collaborative effort. It's an alliance building, a partnership that really make this work. And I want to call your attention to again, this new mindset. You might have noticed by now, the tagline for this conference is a new spectrum mindset. And I hope to be able to spend a couple of minutes just kind of dissect that a little bit with you. Next slide, please. So just a bit of introduction. I serving Microsoft in support of the Airband initiative, which many of you have either heard or may have even interacted with our effort, which is really about connecting the unconnected and putting ourselves forward as part of the solution to the great challenge of bridging the digital divide. And my colleague will have talked, and Shelley McKinley from Microsoft will be talking about, so I will be very brief on that. Just next slide, please. Airband is first and foremost a partnership program, and we do utilize a set of technologies, including TV white space, which you hear a lot from Microsoft, but it's certainly not just a TV white space. But given the context of talking about spectrum sharing and incumbent protection, I thought I would use this as an example of how that has been done in a very successful way. David Salomão from Moçambique early on said about the challenges about the sharing between incumbents and the new ISPs. I'm happy to report that throughout all the TV white space deployments that we've been involved in, there is also zero incidents of interference. And part of the reason is that the TV white space, which is a implementation of the dynamic spectrum access model, is designed with incumbent protection at its core. So the TV white space geolocation database, for example, is designed to help prevent harmful interference to the incumbents. And when we talk about incumbents here, it's not just the broadcasters, but also the PMSC. For example, in UK, in US, those microphone users. So it's built in the solution. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, Airband is first and foremost a partnership program, and this is a multi-stakeholder partnership that we work with, both the commercial ISP, internet service providers, as well as the ecosystem equipment vendors, and very importantly, the governments and the regulators around the world. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, that there's many players, many actors in this ecosystem, and there are three main components that really turning the wheel. Is the regulatory component, which deals with the policy, the spectrum allocation, spectrum access, the technology community, which really bring about innovation, the technology that are enabling sharing, and then of course the business community who actually implements networks and connect people. Not the least, but the civil society like ISOC that Jane is with, and the academic institutions are also part of this ecosystem. In the next slide, I will give a couple of examples on how these different entities come together in actually putting the spectrum sharing into practice in a successful way. The first example is the Mawingu network from Kenya, which is really one of the earliest TV white space application in Africa. And I want to call your attention, not only to just the deployment itself, but just the actors that are involved in this effort. As you can see, Mawingu is a regional ISP based out of the north of Nairobi in a place called Nanyuki town. And it's really a new entrant and a rural ISP with the support from the regulator, the Communications Authority of Kenya, and the ministry. And in collaboration, in fact, in this case, with the broadcasters in Kenya, two of the main signal distributors, they were able to actually start some of the pilot TV white space deployments even before a regulatory framework is put in place. And so that's just one great example of how this, how we can experiment on spectrum sharing with the collaboration of, parties who are, sometimes on the opposite side of the fence. Chairman Pai even talked about earlier in the US, for example, it's also a collaborative effort between the TV white space community with the Broadcast Association, the NAB. In this case, not only the regulators and the industry collaborate together, there's also involvement from academia, in this case, the Strathmore University, who is also assisted by the International Development Agency from UK, DFID, and now it's called FCD, I believe, FCDO. And together with DSA and DSA members like Microsoft and Adaption. So really, you can see that there's a number of actors together in making of this innovative solution, which during the COVID time, Mawingu was able to work towards connecting over 180 rural clinics, which is a very timely solution to help people in Kenya to cope with the COVID. Another example I want to bring to you is the Lavaza project from Colombia. And again, this is a great example of showing just how diverse the partnerships, the collaborative effort is coming out of Colombia, where you have the Lavaza Foundation, which is, for those of you who are coffee addicts, this Italian coffee company that started a partnership with AOO, which is a partnership building company in Colombia, and Macaya, which is a nonprofit. And they started to build an alliance that aimed at bringing technology, bringing new productivity to the coffee growing region of Colombia, which happened to be part of the rebel-controlled region that a few years ago, the previous president Santos was able to broker the peace deal, which won him the Nobel Prize. And this project is a contributing factor to that reconciliation with the rebel groups, and now to reintegrate them into the new digital economy. And Microsoft, together with the regulator A&E, Martha was the lead of A&E at that time. We were just very grateful to be part of that project, and that is using TV white space again and other technologies to connect the coffee growing regions of Colombia and connecting schools and clinics, and also giving the coffee farmers new ways of selling their products. There are plenty of other examples, which I list on the right-hand side of the screen, but due to time, we just wouldn't have time to go through. But I encourage you to connect with me if you would like to understand more about those examples. Next slide, please. So I want to spend maybe the last couple of minutes just talk about the mindset. As you heard from many speakers throughout this conference, spectrum sharing is, it's quite a common sense, but like, Stephen Covey, the author of the 7 Habits book, used to say that common sense is not necessarily common practice. And a big part of that is because the mindset shift, the paradigm shift takes a far longer time, and it's more difficult than the technology shift, which oftentimes leads the shift of the mindset. And I contrast in Microsoft, part of our corporate culture is what we call the growth mindset. And if you would apply that thinking to spectrum world, really, you talk about, do you assume spectrum as a scarcity resource, or do you assume spectrum can be abundant? And because of time, I wouldn't be able to go through all the points, but I guess many of the speakers in this conference have highlighted the fact that the human factors are indeed the most difficult part of the shift from a predominantly, static exclusive allocation to a dynamic shared access. But I believe with all the technology advances, with all the, the conferences like this, people share the minds that we are able to go from a spectrum competition towards a spectrum collaboration, which really will bring about the days of the spectrum abundance. So my concluding slides, please. Next. Yeah, so as out in my window is the breaking of dawn. So I really would want to say, dare we say, the days of spectrum abundance that can be upon us if we were to work together and build alliance towards that direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeffrey. And I love the point that you made about spectrum sharing should be the new normal. I couldn't agree with you more. And as everyone has highlighted across the different presentations, there's the human factor of negotiation, of coalition building, of changes in regulatory proceedings to be more inclusive, and just the challenges that are out there and doing everything. And we may come back to you on the point that you had just raised about the growth mindset in a bit in the Q&A. Well, now, excellent. Okay, so we're going to bring all our panelists up now. And excellent. We're going to have Q&A now, and we'll be taking questions from the audience, and those will come in through the great facilitation here by the team that's helping us with the broadcast. Right now, though, in order to sort of get us started and exercise our thinking here on spectrum sharing and protecting incumbents through the coalition building, I'm going to start with David. David, you had indicated that MNOs and ISPs don't have the same mindset, that there was some skepticism from the MNOs when you were working with them in Moçambique to do more to encourage a broader use of spectrum, to allow for more services, and to provide for better socioeconomic development in the country. Can you tell us in 1 to 2 minutes what some of your techniques were for trying to convince the MNOs to try and go along with this? Because as Jeffrey said, the scarcity issue may be more marketing at times than it's a reality. We're seeing this in the US with tribal communities. A lot of that spectrum's not being used, and there are a lot of people who need access. So we're seeing changes around the world. So tell us a bit more in Moçambique about what you did and what some of your techniques were to help shift that mindset.
Thank you for your question, Jane. We started by allocating spectrum, which was we'll give you a resource for you to use, but allow us to reuse it where you are not there. Okay. That was point number one. If you say you're gonna give them something and you want to reuse where they're not there, they'll say, okay, you can use wherever we are not there, but we already know where you're not there. The point is, the moment they understand that you want to reuse in a specific point, they'll just put the dummy base station to make sure that you do not use it over there. That's when you understand that the game is not being played fair. And then you try to show evidence, data, previous projects, examples on how, spectrum sharing can be used. I'm not saying to provide voice or service that will be competing directly with the service, but in this new normal, access to the internet is fundamental for anybody who wants to have education. So we cannot say that whoever has access to the internet can have access to education and other service, which now became the center of how we educate people. Then you start to negotiate, and you say, I know you are not there, and that dummy base station is just a dummy base station, so allow me to use your spectrum. So there will be, several legal issues, compliance issues, and I would say that most of these companies, they're not Mozambican companies. They're just registered in Mozambique. They're not from here. So that's where you find the biggest problem, because the corporate issues are so much complicated that you cannot navigate among them. And neither we can get a session with the person who actually can decide. At some point, you have to say, I'm going to take the spectrum. And that's what we end up doing after, I would say, 3 to 4 weeks ago. We start taking spectrum for whatever doesn't cooperate with what we are planning to do for the country. So if you're not playing the game fairly, that's the downline of not being able to negotiate. When you're not able, you just take whatever it's yours, because at the end of the day, you need to serve the people. The owner of the spectrum is not the regulator. The regulator is mandated to allow that this resource is well used by MNOs to provide a service to the people. So if you're not able to do that, then you take the spectrum. That's the bottom line where nobody wants to reach. But if that's the case, that's the ultimate solution. So I wouldn't say sometimes you are able to negotiate, sometimes you are not. Sometimes you have to go to extreme measures, but to allow people to use a service that you actually need them to use. I would say it's easy to work with somebody which has a small business and is willing to grow. And he's providing internet for free, but the USF is subsidizing the cost of that, the transport and all the needs that MNO has to provide internet to that specific point. For example, the regulator can give you spectrum for 5G for free, as long as you provide 5 kilometers of free access to the internet on the state that you decide to use the spectrum. That's the deal, the kind of deals we are trying to do. It's either you take it or you don't take it. But if you don't give me my 5 kilometers, I'm taking my spectrum back. Sorry for that.
Well, and I like the point that you're making about being a steward. And a lot of people don't realize that government officials have to do a lot to be stewards of that spectrum and create a different environment. I think all of you have hit on the fact that we're in a different, this is a different architecture when you're talking about small, medium, and large networks, no single points of failure, interoperability, and the importance of taking some of the old rules that were put in place a long time ago and freshening them up and creating some change. The other thing that you hit on that was very important is data and mapping mapping where people are and are not, so that you can go in and say, well, gosh, you really aren't using that spectrum, and or you could share it, or there's a secondary use potential here. I'm going to take that good information from you, David, and turn over to Jose. Jose, you're working now with a new proceeding in Peru, and you've just told us about that. Can you give us a little bit more information about how you think you're going to build coalitions? Jeffrey and Preston have given us some great information from the industry side about what they're doing and how interesting it can be to work with such different groups of people. You have military, normal regulatory issues, normal policy issues from ministries. You have companies, you've got technical community like us and civil society. So what do you think you're going to be doing? We're not asking you to give us the whole, the secrets of what's going on right now, but give us an idea of what you think you might be doing to build a big coalition for support for what you're doing. Because this is really important work you're doing, looking at 5G, but also looking at 6 gigahertz in the unlicensed spectrum.
Thank you, Jane. Our roadmap is in the document that has been published yesterday. So we have basically 3 points. The first is the allocate and channeling the 26 gigahertz band in the first ways, and it will be the first time in Peru. Also, the second part of the document is we are preparing the next award of spectrum, and we want to join 3.5. We have 300 megahertz in this band, with also the 800 megahertz in millimetric wave. So we will have more than 1 gigahertz for the next award. It will be the biggest auction in Peru in their history. And also in this award, we want to refarm the band. And also we have a little part of the band, is like 3.7 until 3.8, that we are thinking that it can be for the verticals. We think it will be a more efficient use of the spectrum because we have satellite use in this part of the band. So we think that if the verticals can allocate the spectrum and use, it will better for us and for development of the 5G. And finally, is the identification of 500 megahertz for Wi-Fi 6. We are working very hard. Before, I don't remember, 1 month ago, we have a meeting with FCC. They explain us the 5G fast plan. Well, they allocate more spectrum, and they explain us. But, well, this is a public consultation. We expect maybe yesterday I was talking with Marta. She told me, no, Jose, we need more. Also, we read the news in Chile that they are also allocating more spectrum, but we are waiting. It's a technical document. We want to listen of all the parties, and basically this is our roadmap in short run. Also, we are working a regulatory framework about TV white space. It is a little not so fast because I need to change some things in our legal framework, but we also work in that. I expect that a public consultation about TV white space maybe will be ready for December, well, next month. So we are working very hard about that.
Wow, that's a lot to do, and we commend you for all of the great work in Peru, and we know that you are a strong partner also in CITEL, in the PCC2, and we're keen advocates of working in the region and informing others about what other governments have done. And you've just given us also a good best practice. Thank you for publishing your document also in English. I know that Spanish, of course, is your mother tongue and in the region, but having that proceeding published provides more transparency, clarity, and good best practices for others around the world to copy you or to innovate like you are. And this helps others like us champion innovative use of spectrum while protecting those incumbents, but looking at building those coalitions and taking your good practices. So thank you for that. And we also know that you're under a lot of pressure. All of us are with COVID. It's been a weird amplifier, but in a good way, of change that we've seen from Ghana to your country to Chile, as you're saying, and also the United States, South Africa, where all of a sudden the use of this resource is becoming even more microscopically looked at. And in that sense, I want to turn to Preston. Given that there's so much attention now to connectivity, it's been our lifeline during COVID. People are studying from home, working from home, socializing to keep their spirits up. All of a sudden, the role of different entities like yours and the government officials is becoming really much in the spotlight. And collaboration across ministries and across industries and across different stakeholders is showing up more and more. So I know you went over to Google to do more of the technical work on CBRS, but you mentioned this coalition building that you've had to do. Can you tell us if there's anything different right now that's going on, Preston, that you're feeling in the market or you're seeing from the regulatory policy side from where you sit, and how that's going to play out, you think, going forward?
So I think we can accept that spectrum is a new normal. If you look at the United States, 6 gigahertz of shared spectrum, 3.45 to 355 will be shared with DoD. CBRS is the only 5G band. We still have the C-band, which is the old-fashioned model of exclusive, clear, and exclusive. But the bulk of the spectrum under consideration in the United States is clearly shared spectrum. The interesting thing I think we've done with CBRS and our coalition building is to change the mindset that shared spectrum is for unlicensed Wi-Fi. When we created DICE band, and I think it was the third DICE band I chaired, my TPC rejected every paper from industry. And when I called them, I said, what the hell? I need them to come. I need their money. The answer was, well, everyone knows that shared spectrum is for unlicensed. And we've had this mindset that makes commercial operators, anyone making money, an outsider. And yet those are the very people we need to bring their political pressure, to bring their values, to be able to make offerings to society. And so I think what we've done, we started out with the full opposition of CTIA, with the U.S. Carrier Association and the major tier ones in the United States. And by the time the new administration came in, they were filing on how they wanted the rules tweaked. And so proving that not only is shareable spectrum good for unlicensed and for projects that don't have good monetization models, but to see the Verizons, the Ericssons, and Nokias fully weigh in that, yes, shared spectrum is a perfectly good way to run a mobile operator service, be it offload or primary contact. I think I saw an article in Fierce Wireless on will 6 gigahertz be dominated by NRU or by Wi-Fi? Whatever you think of that answer, it's a dialogue no one would have had 3 years ago to imagine Nokia, Ericsson building into unlicensed like bands. So I think breaking the model that is, it's for Wi-Fi and local and things that don't have money models is important. We need to have the monetization, the industry behind us in pushing this. We don't want to make this little people versus industry. We kind of know how those answers come out. We want to make this industry versus incumbents and put the power. A lot of people didn't like PALs that we did in CBRS, which was sort of a halfway house between shared and unshared, where people could buy protection, but they couldn't buy exclusivity. So you get protection if you build bandwidth, because we want to make people, what's the goal? The goal is to have spectrum filled. So a lot of people kind of walked out of CBRS, but that was important as sort of a halfway house for people who were not used to this. So I think it's really important that we broaden our ideas of what shared spectrum is usable for and spend more time thinking about how do multiple partners coexist in shared spectrum, rather than just how does shared spectrum coexist with an incumbent. Because that's what we need to get more than one person looking at this spectrum. Long-winded dialogue, sorry, Jane.
No, actually, what you've also highlighted for us is the importance of breaking the model. Some of the old rules are not going to meet the more agile, the agility of companies that are coming in that have new needs. The fact that we are taking a look at spectrum that has, been fallow, as some might say, or not used. And or the new technologies that are in place, some of the work that you're doing to show people that this can be done. There's a big fear factor for companies. And I think that also from the government side is you don't want to break things too much, but you do want to break the old models, right? So there's the happy breaking things, and then there's the not so happy. And I think this is part of the challenge on the messaging when we're working across the different parties, is to how to message that up and break that fear factor while breaking the old models. And I think that's a nice segue over to you, Jeffrey, because like Preston, you're looking at this from a different mindset. You're working with governments around the world. You're trying to bring in more connectivity. Tell us a little bit more about how you manage that fear factor with companies that may not be ready to move, or a government that may not be as agile? You had a great partner in Marta with the Lavazza project in Colombia. But what happens when you go into a country where they may not have as much data, or there isn't as much ability to move as quickly and or take in your ideas? How do you break the fear factor, and how do you work across those different parties?
Thank you, Jen. That's a really good question. And indeed, I think I wish I had more time to spend a bit on my last slide. It's talking about the barriers to spectrum sharing is indeed the fear of not having enough. That fear factor, I think, Chairman Pai mentioned about parenting being a great, teacher for this discussion, is that even when we try to teach our kid, the more you share, the more you get. It's counterintuitive. So that's why I want to go back to the point that the mindset shift is really the thing that we need to start with, is by sharing the examples of how the technology have changed things. I think 10 years ago, many speakers have mentioned that we wouldn't be able to have this discussion because technology is just not there, not mature enough to actually enable that kind of sharing and still give you peace of mind. And so I think that, starting with the abundance mindset, as opposed to be something, spectrum is so scarce that you have to just compete for it and grab it and keep it and or even hoard it. And I guess a lot of times we need to work with the regulator and work with the local industry to really put a proof of concept in place. Just, no matter how much you say about it, I think it's just human nature that everyone want to see it with their own eyes, want to be able to have the data points that are local to the environment. So that's why you see a lot of pilot projects at the early days of the DSA working with the regulators, with the local partners to actually show the technology in practice, and for them to be able to gather data, and that data goes back to the regulator as the input when they design rules. And I think one thing that I believe Mr. Marnik from Ofcom mentioned about is that our traditional way of designing policy and rules are really based on the worst case scenario always. And we want to be so conservative, so protective that we basically design a system to death. But rather, I think the DSA model give you, with a database and in the future, maybe with the incorporation of AI, even the kind of technology will allow the regulators to actually design the rules based on real-time data, the real utilization, rather than the worst-case scenario. So that's just one example of how we overcome that fear factor.
Thank you very much, because that mindset shift is something that we all run into every day. And it's been fascinating for some of us who are championing complementary types of networks and shared access or secondary use, or liberalizing more spectrum and 6 gigahertz for Wi-Fi in the US, as you mentioned, Preston. This has been a big deal for some of the community networks we work with, who sometimes they're nonprofit, sometimes they're profit into nonprofit, they're different models. And there have been a lot of people afraid to allow in these small networks that are actually doing great work and have provided connectivity during COVID. So that's been a mindset shift that we've actually seen from our side at the Internet Society. And I know Steve Song, who introduced us before, and Marta have been big champions working with us to find that balance where people can see how to bring in more of a coalition to provide that connectivity. And breaking that fear factor and the mindset shift, I'm going to shift over to you, David. Jeffrey mentioned something important about proof of concept, which goes back to data, which goes back to information, and it goes back to advocacy and or lobbying that we have to do to advocacy from our side, because we're not official lobbyists. But when you're trying to convince someone that doing what you want to do is a good thing, tell me a little bit more about, do you share the proof of concept in Mozambique with the senior officials that you're trying to convince? If the Prime Minister were to say to you, David, really, what is this going to do for the country, and how is this going to help me politically? Do you show him case studies, or how do you brief him? and encourage people to understand that what you're doing is a good thing. So what is your proof of concept that you use?
Jane, allow him to use it.
Exactly.
That's the easiest proof of concept.
Show them
that something actually works. You bring the equipment, turn it on, and let him use it.
Brilliant. You take the person to the place.
Yeah. And then the next thing, he's gonna invite you for a coffee. Dead on. Then he's gonna ask you questions about speed, about if it's similar to his internet office, what are the problems that you might face. And then the last thing he will say is, how much money do you need to do this? Here, 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 and here. And then you have to explain him that perhaps we should not look at it as on a political perspective, but on the needs of the people. Let's go and ask the people, because who's gonna maintain the equipment for us? Who's gonna vouch for the equipment? Who's gonna be the eye? Who's gonna let us know that the equipment is not working normally? People from the community. So we need to work hand in hand. We know what he wants, and he has to understand that we also need to ask people if they can support us, because at the end of the day, no matter which initiative you do, no matter how much money you have to make the initiative financially and socially sustainable, you need the people. You still need the people. So you just show them that it does work. Here at the Communication Regulatory Authority, we did the trials ourselves with the support of several colleagues from the DSA many times. And once we have done that, and us engineers and the people who write the regulations are comfortable with the technology, everything moves smoothly inside the regulator. Now let's take this from the regulator outside to the industry. It's not the industry bringing us the idea or the concept. It's us taking out the concept. And then comes what you're asking me about people who do not understand what we do, but they like to use the technology. I mean, they do not, these things of antennas and everything, it's out of their scope. It's not what you have to tell them, not what you have to sell them, not a document. You just put the antenna, turn it on, and ask them to do whatever you will do on a normal day basis. You tell them which one is the Wi-Fi, he will log in, he will start using it, he'll do a video call, and then the next thing you see is the president of Mozambique inaugurating a school in rural areas of Mozambique and being able to make a video call, or ask students to log into a specific government website to look at documents of the state and information, and then it's done. That's the best way to deal and to negotiate. I can assure you, if everybody does the same thing, we won't have this discussion about how to use the spectrum, how many people can use. I mean, as soon as you have a company that can give you a database for dynamic spectrum access, and you have proved the concept and you have showed that it actually works, the remaining things are just commas, I would say.
I love that. The remaining things are commas, but also you're showing them. And I think this is something that we're all seeing is the importance of the case studies and or getting that data out, where Mozambique can now be a case study for other parts of sub-Saharan and the world to show people that this is doable. We're finding that sending that message, as you said, some people don't understand what an antenna is. We have to show them the proof of what it does for people, right? That's the socioeconomic side, which is and the political side on occasion for what we're doing. I'm going to jump over to Jose. David just given us an example of what he's been doing in his country, showing proof of concept. And he exemplified for us that there are times that people have a hard time understanding what we all do. They don't understand spectrum, they can't see it. You've got to explain it to them, right? And so when we talk about unlicensed in Peru, did you have any challenges when you were first trying to introduce the importance of unlicensed spectrum, and now with the new proceeding that you have and potentially looking at more unlicensed spectrum than 6 gigahertz, have you had any people ask you, well, why would we do unlicensed spectrum proceedings? Why would we allow this? We've seen how much it's taken off. I'm on a Wi-Fi network right now. I've been in meetings in international treaty conferences where people will push back on us and say, well, everything has to be licensed. Tell me, did you run into any challenges in Peru, or has this been a fairly easy thing to introduce?
Thanks, Jane. Well, it's very difficult because, like David say to us, also Jeffrey, also Preston, with the spectrum we can reach to reduce the digital divide. But in Peru, for example, all the spectrum for IMT, we need to allocate about auction. Only in this emergency health, we have an exceptional measure, not like the decree we have approved. But for an unlicensed, now we have a very bad experience now with Wi-Fi, for example, in the homes, in the works. For example, we have about increased about more than 30% of the traffic. So in the cities, all the network is ability to have a big traffic, but in the business buildings, not in residence. So they need to change many things. So in these ways, for example, I now in my work, but in my home, I have my children in education. My wife working in work at home, and it's difficult to have a very good connection. So it is why it is the motive that we began to study the Wi-Fi 6 for home, no? And we expect that we have very good results. Last week I have listened in another sectors of IMT sectors that they say, oh no, we need to study more this spectrum. So I don't know. We can see, but also about like trials that you told me, or like tests. We have, for example, Internet para Todos. Internet para Todos is a very good experience in Peru because I think it's a very good moment. Because we have a special law that it was approved in 5 years ago, that the operator that develop an infrastructure in rural zones, they can use the enterprise, the mobile operators, must be used this infrastructure in rural zones. So also with that, and with the beginning operations of the 5 regional projects of broadband, they have a special alliance. So we have the broadband in rural zone that is very expensive, ready in some regions. We have this special figure of Operador Infraestructura Móvil Rural. And also we have an enterprise like Internet para Todos that is a very good effort, and they work together with us and with the operators of that regional broadband. So we have this a very good result. For example, maybe in other countries similar, we have that notice that citizens, children in rural zones, they need to walk many kilometers to have a signal, because the education program is Aprendo en Casa, use of internet, and also the TV, and also the radio frequencies. So we talk with Internet para Todos. They have a deployment planned at the end of the year. We talk with them, and they can accelerate that deployment. And in 2 weeks, we can infrastructure and connectivity in a rural zone. No? So it's we, like you say, in this emergency the COVID, we need to work together and think special use. So now we are working on that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And it is interesting to see where you do get the pushback, where you can see the coalitions being built, where you know as yourself, where you have your family at home, why the connectivity is so important. And you mentioned Internet para Todos, which is a great project that you're working on in the country, Internet for All, something that we're a huge champion of and every single person here is. And I think that's one of the great messages from this group about how to work together to create better connectivity across all the different types of champions. I'm going to ask Jeffrey and Preston one more question, and then we'll wrap it up. Preston, any other advice on breaking models, breaking down the fear factor, messaging up, dealing with big entities like DoD? Like, how was that? I mean, when you're talking about building coalitions, sometimes you do have to go to some of the biggest actors in a country. Anything you can provide to the audience here about some experience from that you thought was useful about breaking models and creating more agility?
Yeah, I think one thing that made our experience different was how it was incepted. If you want big spectrum, you got to go to big players, and certainly the government was there. But the argument, CBRS came from PCAS, President's Council of Advisors, Science and Technology, and it proposed that federal spectrum should be shared. Almost every spectrum effort we've talked about here was someone wanting to use the spectrum. That was not at all the basis for PCAS. The basis for PCAS, just happened to have in front of me, said it was to spur economic growth. And the champion for the PCAS report was Jason Furman, who was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. And its argument was, look at all the wealth we've created in America because the internet was scalable. Pretty much every post-Microsoft tech blow-up was built around the internet. My own company, thankfully, they could pay me because the internet was available. They could reach their users. More recently, we have cloud computing. So we have this wonderful on-ramp where people can start a small business, get a couple $1 million, and they can go out and try it. And if it works, it scales. And when we talked to CEA, it was, well, if you need spectrum, you're out of luck. You wait every 8 years, we get an auction, you put down $5 billion. Who's going to put $5 billion before they even know if it works? And so creating scalable entry into markets was the real argument behind PCAS. We had no idea who would use it. And so it was an alliance, not of potential spectrum users, but of the economic engine, of people who wanted to score economic victories for the administration, a good incentive. And so, the Council of Economic Advisors did a lot of the heavy lifting in the White House to get it ultimately an executive memorandum out that would then let all us techies go and do the work. So I think we also need to look broader on the impacts and not focus on who wants to use the spectrum, and that's the coalition we want to build. I think we need to look outside, which is a lot more treating. I never understood his argument for supporting it. I couldn't understand all that economic blather. He probably didn't understand mine for saying it worked. But it created a coalition based on, we want to create a venture economy around spectrum. So I think we can look very far for what are good coalition partners, and not necessarily think of them as telcos, ISPs, and people who have radios and antennas, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, and it's taking the technical and making it understandable for everyone. You mentioned scale, and I think, Jeffrey, you work for Microsoft. It's a big company. You might be considered an incumbent in one area, not in another. Your shift into cloud computing is in content delivery and storage is huge, yeah? So when you're looking at scale and also the mindset shift, can you give us some final thoughts on what you'd like to add based on the shift that you're seeing in your own company?
Yeah, thank you, Jen. I think that is really a very good question. in reflecting the way that Microsoft as a big corporation has shifted its own business model and more so the mindset from a predominantly a software company to a cloud computing service company and be an artificial intelligence platform. I think that it really speaks to the growth mindset that I mentioned earlier, is to really if you think back of the Kodak moment that everyone is oftentimes reminded of, right? If you do not break the mold yourself, someone else will break the mold. And talking about scale, I think cloud computing is all about scaling. And the principles and philosophy behind cloud computing, which is really virtualization and pooling of resource so that it can actually have its own demand access, that's precisely what we need to see happening in the Spectrum world, where it is not a on-demand system at the moment. But if you were to apply the cloud computing principles and technologies and AI with all the data, the big data that you are able to gather, then the belief is that we are going to be able to utilize Spectrum more as a service as opposed to be as a property that multiple entities will do a fist fight about, and by doing so, it's getting a very much politicized. So in my concluding slide where I mentioned that the shift from maybe a political spectrum, I believe Spectrum will never be fully depoliticized. That's just kind of pipe dream. But our hope is that it will become less political but more computational. And by that I mean is I also use the word tech intensity, which is really to apply all the goodies or the technologies that the regulators actually regulate, but use them for the regulators' own sake, that use them to manage the Spectrum resources more in a computational way, as opposed to be just a human, rely on human factor. There's a lot of limitation there. So that's really, reflecting about the transition that Microsoft itself has gone through. I'm very optimistic to see, the Spectrum world doing the same, and what to bring us to the days of Spectrum abundance, I believe.
Excellent. If Spectrum sharing is our new normal and there's more abundance, if we can break down some of those political walls, we know they'll always be there, as you said, and that was a very good point, because government needs use for security and for economic stability. Companies are changing with technology changing, and that puts pressure on regulators and policymakers to find quick solutions. And we have, of course, the pandemic that's adding a little bit more pressure to all of our lives to do what we do, get the messaging out, break down those walls, and break down some of the mindsets. We've seen massive shift already in the last 6 to 8 months. Like, I've been shocked to see how fast some regulators and policymakers are making Spectrum available, or changing, David, universal service funds to match up. And something that I just will close with is that when we shifted from one infrastructure model, the old telco model, and we added in different layers on computing, new technologies for Spectrum use, antennas, databasing, now we've got hosting, and we have networks to networks and not single points of failure because of the distributed architecture infrastructure. Some of the mindsets have to shift along with the rules, the regs, the financing, and how we approach it as stakeholders. And so you've all given us an excellent window, sort of an opportunity to take a look into how companies are taking a look at this, how governments around the world are looking at proceedings or showing proof of concept so that they can shift change. But I just want to thank all of you again, David, Jose, Jeffrey, and Preston. This has been an excellent panel. It's recorded so that others can take a look at it later. And please, for the audience out there, some great presentations, which will give you some more data about what everyone is doing to do what we can on Spectrum sharing, protect incumbents, but through coalitions, create change. It really is about how quickly we can create that change and shift some mindsets, but do it all in a transparent manner with more clarity. And thank you, Jose, for that with your proceeding. And we'd just like to thank you again and thank DSA for this amazing opportunity and for virtualizing a summit, which we all hope we can see each other in person next year. But this has been an excellent platform for debate. So thank you very much. And thank you to the technicians. Also, I always forget to do that, but these are the people behind the scenes making this happen. So thank you very much. And I believe at this point, we're going to go back over to Steve. So thank you again, and we're going to close out the panel. Steve, over to you. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Jane, and to all the panelists for an excellent panel. I think for me, it's such a profound message. This for technologists that for myself, have to relearn the fact that many of these problems are social and political problems more than they are technological problems. What the internet technologists call a layer 9 problem. And it's a privilege to listen, to be here with people like Preston Marshall and Michael Calabrese, who are co-authors of the PCAST report, which I think really introduced a tectonic shift in thinking about how we can think about spectrum licensing. And Preston's comment about scalable entry into markets, I think, is a perfect segue into this next session, because what we see with spectrum sharing is the unlocking of the market for smaller operators. And yet the ecosystem for supporting those smaller operators has yet to really evolve. And I think a pioneer in this space has been Microsoft, who from a very early stage hasn't just backed dynamic spectrum, especially TV white space regulation, but through initiatives like the Airband initiative, have gone out of their way to support those smaller operators.